Greetings, everyone, to the Swedenborgian online community's Thursday evening chat, discussion, interview, depending on the week. Tonight we are uh, blessed and honored to have Dr. Devin Zuber joining us here in a minute. Um, in the meantime, I want to welcome you to this affirming um, interfaith community. We base the core of our tradition on a mystical theologian, a Christian theologian, who thought heaven was full of diverse peoples. And so we lean into that diversity, that openness, and affirming nature, and try to uplift you wherever you are in your walk. Greetings to you all in the chat. Hi, how are you doing? And I want to say I'm quite excited about our guest this evening. Dr. Devin Zuber was one of my professors in seminary, and he is a magnificent spirit, a wonderful human being, and he's quite super busy. So he has books in the works besides his professorships in the Graduate Theological Union and the Center for Swedenborgian Studies. He also has a full family, 2 daughters and his wife. And I know he's busy with connecting with them this evening. He still has some parental duties, but I'm sure he'll be on here in a second. And it's amazing that I had the pleasure of being in class with Dr. Zuber, because he made our trip, my class, my cohort's trip to Sweden happen. It's a requirement for seminarians and for specifically Masters of Divinity students in the Pacific School of Religion to have an immersion class/trip. And there's a lot of different options. There's really wonderful, like, social justice oriented options with the Pacific School of Religion, very liberal, progressive theological school. But, we had this pipe dream of perhaps going to Sweden because that's where the theologian Emanuel Swedenborg is from. And it would be really cool to just see his digs. There's actually landmarks for him there, which is interesting. A lot of historical things having to do with Swedish culture and even, their First Peoples culture and things like that. And so we thought it could be amazing to get to go. And Devin made it happen. We are currently honored in this Swedenborgian online community Thursday interview and chat by being welcomed and welcoming towards Dr. Devin Zuber, who is now on the line. How are you doing, Devin?
I'm doing well, yeah.
I explained that you are quite busy. Not only your professorship in the Graduate Theological Union and the Center for Swedenborgian Studies, but you have books in the works, you have a family, and a lot of other, I can't even name them. You could probably have a litany of your responsibilities for us. So can you tell us about your work with the Graduate Theological Union and the Center for Swedenborgian Studies?
My pleasure. So I've been teaching full-time here in Berkeley at the Center for Swedenborgian Studies since January of 2011. Wow, which makes it coming up on 8 years. And my background and training is actually not in religion or theology. I did all my graduate work in philosophy, American studies, or literature. And I ended up writing my dissertation on the ways that Swedenborg's ideas were used by American transcendentalists, that group of writers and thinkers in the 19th century, including Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who were so important for creating a new way of looking at the natural world. And I grew up Swedenborgian, so I come from a long line of people who've been connected to the Swedenborgian church tradition, actually going back to my great great grandfather, I think,
Oh, wow.
in Sweden. So the material wasn't unfamiliar for me when I sat down to do graduate work in this area. But I never in a million years would have expected to have ended up teaching in a cool place like the Graduate Theological Union, Swedenborg Studies. Prior to coming to Berkeley, I was a professor of American Studies, assistant professor of American Studies in Germany, in a small university in the northern part of that country. So a very secular context where most of my students were undergrads, gearing to become teachers in the federal public school system in Germany. And when I was first encouraged to apply for the opening in Berkeley, I thought, they've got the wrong guy. I might know my Swedenborg, but I'm not a theologian. I don't do religious studies. I'm not cut out for this. But once I ended up in California for the job interview and met the Divinity students at the GTU, and especially the Swedenborgian community there, it ended up being a really cool, amazing, interesting, and interdisciplinary place, which is really unique in sort of the ecology of theological education, to have a classroom where you have all the world's major religions often present in the same learning space, and you don't just talk about religion as you tend to do in a more secular context. You have people who are all practitioners of one. So I haven't looked back once since that coming to Berkeley in 2011, and it's been a wonderfully learning and enriching experience. At the GTU, I tend to teach stuff that I'm currently preoccupied in for research and writing my book projects, and one of those major concerns for me has been the environment, thinking about Swedenborgian theology, impact of his ideas in light of the climate change crisis we find ourselves in, the like.
Yeah.
And I'm the co-director of a new initiative at the GTU called Sustainability 360, which is aiming to be a think tank and generator of interreligious ideas on sustainability from an interdisciplinary perspective. And I co-lead that with Dr. Rita Sharma, who is the director of our Center for Dharma Studies, Hindu Studies.
Well, that's quite amazing that you were welcomed into this community in a way that kind of drew you in, and you're doing such good inroads with eco-criticism, ecology, and really important subject for today, as a lot of our listeners agree. How is that project? What are the details? What kind of efforts are you making?
We've already done a couple of things under its banner, because the GTU is in Berkeley, and although it's a private consortium of all these different seminaries and religious institutions, we partner a lot with the University of California at Berkeley, and UC Berkeley has a very robust program in environmental studies, and someone there who's been very important for my own thinking and work is a environmental historian named Carolyn Merchant, who in many ways is sort of the godmother of ecofeminism, and wrote some seminal works on thinking about environmental crisis from an ecofeminist perspective. So Carolyn, who is an indefatigable machine of thinking and writing and philosophical reflection, she finally retired last spring, became emerita, and we had a 3-day celebration with a conference attached to it, celebrating her contributions to the study of environment and religion and ecology and religion, which included a big reception and panel at the Graduate Theological Union. That was one thing we did. And then most recently, just this past week actually, Governor Jerry Brown, the governor of California, convened an international summit on climate change, a global call for action, which brought together not just academics, but nonprofit people, eco-activists, etc., to spend several days together talking about what's to be done. So our sustainability initiative had a day-long event at the University of San Francisco on interreligious approaches to climate change and some of the ethical questions that an interreligious. So I'm fresh off the heels of that, which was a lot of fun to be part of that conversation. And we've got some more things in the works. We're hoping in the end to actually have some degree programs lodged in the G2 curriculum tied to sustainability. We're starting with a certificate, and we're aiming to build up to a master's program in interreligious sustainability studies. So for all the listeners out there that are interested in Swedenborg, in the not too distant future, you can come to Berkeley and study Swedenborgian theology, get a certificate in Swedenborgian studies, and also do a master's or a similar certificate in green religious thinking and sustainability. It's pretty cool.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's wonderful. Quite inspiring work, and I think you're one of the key inspirations for a recent multimedia service we did around the godliness, the goddessness of ecology, and your focus in that, and of course Swedenborg seeing nature and the world around us is really kind of an uplifting viewpoint when it's emphasized, I think, especially in our living, because our world is at such a crossroads, or maybe past it, right?
Thanks, Cory. It's interesting because for a long time, religion has often been held up as the bad guy in this story and crisis. A lot of environmental historians and people who thought about how do we get to where we are, in particular, sort of pinpointed Judeo-Christianity as the source of this out of balance relationship we have with nature. And although that's certainly in part true, it's only part of the story. And it's lovely that we're now at a moment where faith communities are beginning to be recognized that they have a critical role to play in changing the conversation and the paradigm, because in spite of all our modern science and ostensibly a Western democratic culture, the insight that science brings, a platform for civic making and policies and decision. We've known from science about climate change for a long time now, and if anything, we're taking steps backward away from sensible, sustainable planning for the future. So, given in a sense the failure of science to help inform that conversation, I think lived religion, its rituals, our faith communities, they have a critical role to play, and to do some work where science has perhaps failed. So I love thinking about that being part of your recent worship service.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's quite inspiring that when religion can help fortify kind of our outlook and approach to living in nature as part of it. Yeah, so thank you. And I was sharing a little bit for our listeners who caught the first part of this about how you were the pivotal, leader in getting the Sweden trip, my required immersion trip, uh, done during my master's in seminary. And there's a lot of different trips, but that one was especially meaningful, for us Swedenborgians, because we got to kind of touch on so much of Swedenborg's life and inspiration and connections. And so thank you for that. That was quite the trip.
Oh, you're quite welcome, Cory. What was a highlight for me, very learning for me to experience Sweden through your eyes and others. I spent a lot of time in Sweden over the last 15, 20 years, both on my own as just someone who has friends who live there, but also as a scholar of Swedenborg. I spent a sabbatical away from Berkeley for an academic year at Stockholm University, working every day with Swedenborg collections at the Royal Academy of Sciences. But when you get to go to a place with people who've never been there before and see it through their eyes, you learn all kinds of new things. And it was just awesome to see what you and the other students on the trip did with taking these readings and applying that we visited. And I learned new things, new insights into Swedenborg's life and times by walking those cold, dark, snowy streets in January with all of you.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful that you got so much out of it. For those of us with little context before that, it was quite the gift, amazingly so. And I also wanted to mention, I took a class with you called Swedenborg and the Arts, and you mentioned some of these names before, but it's kind of amazing. It was amazing for me to hear, at least, all these American, especially, but also primarily Western artists, writers, poets that have been influenced by Swedenborg. And you mentioned a few, Emerson, Blake, I believe, and others. Could you share a little bit about your work with that realm?
Oh, that's kind. Hi to everybody who's listening. Thanks for tuning in. And it's funny you asked this, Cory, because just this past Monday, I'm assuming a lot of the listeners and people who are tuning into this are also people who follow Off the Left Eye, the weekly YouTube cast put out by the Swedenborg Foundation that Curtis Childs runs. And this past Monday, the most recent edition was about Swedenborg's influence in these areas, and I appear as a talking head. So,
oh yeah.
Not to sound like a broken record, what I would say right now will probably echo things that were on Off the Left Eye just this week. And
Cool.
I guess I would only preface it by saying, sort of, regardless where you cast your stone to sort of watch those ripples of influence, it's important to keep in mind how kind of wonderfully unexpected this probably was or is for Swedenborg himself. Like when we read his theology, it's fairly clear that he is aiming for very specific sets of individuals in his 18th century context. He wants certain groups of people, like natural philosophers, to chime into what he's saying in divine love and wisdom or divine providence. He really wants Lutherans, especially Lutherans in Sweden, to pay attention to what he's saying polemically in his True Christian Religion from 1772. So he has these very sort of specific academic subsets in mind: theologians, natural scientists. By and large, those groups of established thinkers and theologians don't give his work the time of day. They ignore it, or in the German-speaking context, they mock it, especially after Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, publishes his book about Swedenborg, Dreams of a Spirit Seer.
Wow.
So it's really in these other areas of cultural reception, like the visual arts, poetry, fiction, literature, where we could say Swedenborg has a much broader, more fertile kind of reception, which is sort of funny when you read Swedenborg. It's not like he clearly sets up a manifesto for aesthetics or the beautiful or clear statements about poetic representation. But it's in those areas, for whatever reason, that figures like Emerson or William Blake gravitated towards his writings for something. And I've been thinking about this more recently because I helped organize a conference last year in June 2017 that was specifically devoted to Swedenborg and the arts, and some of my teaching here in Berkeley spun off of that. And it was a great 4 or 5 day event that brought in scholars from all over the world, art historians, literary critics, religious studies people, but also those who came from a more confessional kind of background. And we're finally turning that into a book. So this week I wrote a proposal to the Swedenborg Foundation, and we'll see what they ultimately say, but it's looking good that there will be a really beautiful book specifically devoted to this topic, coming to you soon, because some of the thinking and the writing that conference produced was really groundbreaking. And there have been a lot of books, a lot of edited collections that deal with Swedenborg and his impact. Some of your readers probably know them, like, or listeners, I should say, not readers. Anthology from 1988, A Continuing Vision, also published by the Swedenborg Foundation. But none of those collections have specifically focused on the arts in particular. So this will be a new contribution to something that really hasn't been given sustained attention or thought before.
That's fantastic. That'll be really exciting.
Keep your eyes out for it. Hopefully there will be more buzz about it in the months to come next year.
Oh, wonderful. Well, congratulations on that, as well as, I believe, another completed book, or your first manuscript was completed just a month or two ago. Am I right?
Yes, a little longer ago. I have two books in the work. Perhaps one is the big book, which is an exploration of Swedenborg's impact on American environmental thought, from Ralph Waldo Emerson to John Muir, the California conservationist, and beyond. And that has been given the green light for moving forward with galley stage of publication. I still have to do some things like finishing the index and some final revisions, but that's being published by University of Virginia Press, UVA, and it should see the light of day by October or November of next year. We're hoping that we'll have the book ready for the American Academy of Religion, the AAR, where publishers like UVA like to trot out their new titles in religious studies. So I'm really stoked about that. What will probably appear before that book, though, is a totally unrelated project that I've done with a contemporary performance artist, a woman named Marina Abramovich, who in some ways progenitor of performance art as a 20th century phenomenon into the 21st century. Some people call her the godmother of performance art, but she doesn't like that label. She thinks it makes her sound too old, among other things. And over the course of 2 days, some time ago in Switzerland, actually, I was really privileged to have a long, leisurely conversation with her about how important different esoteric and spiritual traditions have been for her performance art consistently over a 30-year period. So that now has a critical introduction by me and will be published, I'm hoping, in the spring, early summer, with the Swedenborg Society in London that will be collaborating with another press. I'm not going to say the name of that press right now, but it's looking good for a pretty significant publisher of art that will be taking this project on, and that's all done.
Oh,
It just
wonderful.
cleared the footnote. So after many delays, I'll have these two monographs out next year in 2019, which are
Wow.
exciting. And I guess they
really
share a
cool.
parallel in that both deal with art, which is cool.
Yeah, it seems like you gravitate to that more artistic side yourself in certain ways. Of course, you are a scholar, but you seem to really enjoy the arts and connecting with them.
You know, I think that's because I'm a failed wannabe artist at heart. That's my secret story that I'm revealing now to the world for the first time, that I grew up in a family of artists. My mother is a very accomplished painter. Hi, Mom, if you ever listen to this. And my uncle, my mom's brother, was also a fantastic painter and sculptor. So I grew up in a household where art highly valued and was something that people did. I grew up in suburban Maryland outside of Washington, D.C., and as an adolescent, one of my escapes to get away from the sort of conservative environment I was in was to hop on the metro, the subway system, and go into the city where I had the Smithsonian complex and the National Gallery at my fingertips. So I spent a lot of time looking at art.
Wow.
But I never was very good at actually making art. I'm sad to say, you know, I think that is a genetic propensity, and I just maybe I lacked the discipline too. I never really was very good at drawing or painting or those other things. And then I think in college I discovered that there is this thing called art history where you could write about art. And even though I ended up pursuing a graduate degree more tied to literature, my PhD is technically in English literature and American studies, I've always been invested in visual culture and the arts. I think one of my first published essays as a scholar was about the modernist poet Wallace Stevens, who uses a lot of painting in his poetry, and I talked about a Picasso painting that's important for a long poem he wrote, "The Man with the Blue Guitar."
Oh, that's a beautiful painting.
It's been sort of a consistent thread. Even I sort of thought, well, maybe moving to the GTU with all these theologians and religionists, this will be the end of one thing that made my move here actually quite attractive from my initial reservations about leaving the German university system and coming to the unknown of the wild west of California was that the GTU here in Berkeley has a long, long tradition of talking about the arts in dialogue with religion. Since the 60s, since the GTU's inception as an institution, there's been an attention to the visual arts. And they've had an art and religion program in place since then. So I found a lot of dear colleagues who've now become good friends and fellow thinkers through the GTU in art and religion, who've helped me change my thinking about things and how art actually, at its core, has a lot of critical, deep parallels with religious experience and sort of the inner essence of, for many, what comprises the theological, and that the study of art can inform the study of theology and religion and vice versa, even if one doesn't necessarily identify as religious.
Yeah.
It was interesting, and sorry to wax on about this, but in San Francisco, you probably remember, Cory, that our Modern Museum of Art closed for many years for a major renovation. And when they finally reopened their doors, I think in 2016, I still was in Sweden when they finally opened up again, but they passed out this questionnaire to sort of canvass the viewers who were coming back to the museum. And one of the questions on that questionnaire was, you looking at modern art as a spiritual experience. You find spirituality in the Modern Art Museum, which is really kind of interesting and surprising given how ostensibly secular San Francisco as a city space is. That word spirituality still crept in, tied to the viewing of modern art. And I think that
incredible.
That says something about that kind of symbiosis between art and religious experience that's been around for a while. And
Yeah, you know, I think our listeners and viewers appreciate you sharing what you just did. You know, I think the San Francisco area isn't the only one that defines spirituality and art, and I think a lot of us do gravitate to art in some way. And just on your part, I do have to say, I think you're more of an artist than you might give yourself credit for. You know,
Cory,
with your
you've not
published...
seen, I don't know, man.
What?
You've not seen my paintings that my mom still has hanging on her walls.
Hey, you don't have to be great at every kind of art. No. But you know, you share thought and scholarship and these other forms of art in your own artistic way, in text and in your published materials, of course. I mean, that's quite those are quite the achievements, and those are art, and so are your lectures, you sharing, and the many different multifaceted ways you do your teaching, and even I know with your ordination track, your service leading, your preaching. I mean, I think it comes out in a lot of different ways with you. Just may not be like pen to paper in the stereotypical artistic way.
Thanks, Cory. I appreciate that. Sometimes academic writing can be so quarantined and dry and dusty and fusty. So hearing you say that makes me think I was able to smuggle in a bit of style on the side, even where it's often, it's anything but creative writing in many ways. You have to go through the whole citation mafia. Have you read your Foucault and your Derrida? Have you noted?
Yeah.
Exercise. Yeah. Tedious quotation, but I don't know. I think in many ways, like we're living through not just an environmental planetary crisis with climate, but a crisis in the humanities. The lack of money, of public money going towards the arts, towards the teaching of literature and art history, and religious studies and theology is really sort of an epidemic, which in many ways sort of the decline of at least mainline forms of Protestantism, including the Swedenborgian traditions, whose numbers are not, statistically very, very high or increasing. So I think we're at a point where there's a lot of pressure put on writing about art and literature to matter, to have meaning, because its utility and value is really being questioned, critiqued. I experienced this firsthand with my kids. You heard my kids earlier in the car, who are now going to a public school here in Berkeley, which by and large is a really, really great experience. But compared to their education in Germany and Sweden and in German schools, there's a lot more focus on disciplines that are seen as essential for our economy. So STEM, science, technology, and math, like those areas are really where the pedagogy is focused on. because of its sense that this will help ultimately in the end produce a generation of kids who can keep our economy going. And if anything, if you're lucky, the art and the literature, at least in the public school model here, is adjacent. It's an elective, it's on the side, it's not seen as central. And I think that if you don't immerse yourself in the humanities, we can forget what it means to be human. We're not machines.
Yeah.
And literature, the visual arts, dance, music, these have an ethical dimension that our society needs.
Yeah. It's too bad to hear that there's that kind of epidemic and shift away or kind of undercutting of art when it really does, uplift us in many different ways. And in fact, I think without it, as you were saying, we wouldn't be human and we wouldn't be connected, and a lot of things are worthwhile and enlivened by art. In fact, we're, even the sciences in a way you could say, just describe art, like the laws of the universe, math, just kind of describe the patterns that we see in such beautiful forms around us, and the communities and the loving interactions. And if we're not uplifting those things in artistry and freedom, then yeah, you're right, it becomes a little mechanical or dead end, or that's unfortunate.
Yeah, because here we are on a podcast and videocast that's tied to Swedenborg. Our listeners, we all need to sort of keep in mind how artistic Swedenborg himself was. He wasn't just the scientist who became the visionary theologian. There's a critical aesthetic dimension to his life story. His early years writing poetry, his beautiful sketches and illustrations he does, not just for some of his science, but the typography of the later theology. That's also part of his story. And Cory, you can also talk about this. One of the fun things about our trip to see Swedenborg's famous summer house that's now in the Skansen Open Air Museum in Stockholm was peeping through the frostbitten windows and being able to see the little tiny organ against the back wall where Swedenborg meditatively played music in the same space where he was writing and working on his manuscript.
Yes, yeah, he had a piano in there, and I don't know much about that practice of his. So he would sometimes just play for, as you said, meditatively.
But the reflections on Swedenborg's life and biography that really began to be collected in the immediate years after, and later assembled in the 19th century by a German scholar, Friedrich Emanuel Tafel. In the Swedenborgian tradition, we know that as the Tafel documents, which is this massive 3-volume assemblage of as many prime documents Tafel could get his hands on. And there are references to this playing. And there, Swedenborg was very good. He wasn't just sort of a dilettante diddling away on that little organ. He was so good that when he ends up sort of marooned after he comes back from his critical years of growth as a young man in England, he ends up in Skara, Sweden, where his father was the bishop. And because of various reasons, he wasn't allowed to travel abroad again due to political turmoil and other reasons. So he played the organ. He was sort of whiling away his time, and he was so good that sometimes he stood in for the official organist in the Skara Cathedral. And if you go to Skara, it's a gigantic, beautiful medieval space. The organ of Swedenborg's day must have been quite substantive, not at all like the little tiny organ that he has in the summer house. It would have been a massive pipe organ, and he could play it for services. So he was very interested in music. When he is in England writing to his brother-in-law, Eric Benzelius, who's a key conduit for Swedenborg's early engagement with modern science and the dawn of the European Enlightenment, comes through to Benzelius and talks about all these inventions he's working on and sketching in his rented rooms in London and in Oxford. And he talks about designing a universal musical instrument that would create harmony and tones such that anybody who picked it up could create beautiful music with it. Unfortunately, the sketch for this universal musical instrument has disappeared. No one knows where those sketches went. Maybe they'll be recovered someday in an attic. But it's kind of cool that he wasn't just scheming up machine guns and submarines and flying machines, as we all sort of know from the history of Swedenborg as a scientist. He was also thinking about music and trying to make music accessible, a universal musical instrument. Wow. And I think related to that is also just to observe how the concept of harmony is really essential in Swedenborg, in his science, and also then in his theology. So if we attune our ear to listen for the metaphors tied to the structure of music and how it sounds, it's a way into understanding some of the deeper structural principles of his theology.
That's beautiful. And to your comment earlier around poets and other artists being gravitating to Swedenborg, I think it's those allusions to the metaphors or the direct descriptions of spiritual realities where the environment, everything in it corresponds to something very meaningful for the people there in the spiritual realm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And so in a way, if you think of that poetically, okay, I'm going to write a poem about this room. It's everything I'm going to describe is probably trying to convey some deeper meaning.
Right.
It's almost like a spiritual environment. Yeah.
Indeed. Or in a sort of maybe more oblique way, makes him very prescient for perspectives provided by cognitive psychologists in the 20th century. Here we are in Berkeley, and across the street is the linguist George Lakoff, who some of the listeners might know because Lakoff often has done these really wonderful sociological analyses of, say, President Trump's tweets or his Twitter language. But Lakoff and others thought deeply about metaphor and language, and would argue that metaphor is not just a literary device. It's not just saying, my love is red like the sun, where you combine these two different things to make something new in poetry. But it's actually we're hardwired to think metaphorically, to combine different experiences, phenomenal experiences in ways that are part of our thinking. We're hardwired to view the world symbolically and to combine it in innovative ways. And from sort of a deeper time of evolutionary history, this is certainly something to be said about perhaps the human capacity for symbolic thought and representation and language, which is entangled in religion and thinking about the origins of religion as an experience. Maybe that's getting a little too wonky, but
no, not at all.
Certainly something people have thought about in terms of Swedenborg's science too. There's a historian of ideas in Sweden David Duner, D-U-N-E-R, who is a wonderful book on Swedenborg's metaphors in his science. And he takes sort of a cognitive linguistic approach to think about this metaphoricity as a cognitive paradigm that underwrites Swedenborg's scientific worldview.
I love that word, metaphoricity.
Yeah, it's great. It's great stuff. He's a good writer. You don't have to know Swedish. He wrote the book in English, so
Oh, nice.
you can get it from your local library, university library, or nearest Swedenborg Studies Center. It's harder to find in the U.S., but it's a very interesting.
Well, that's such a central. I mean, it's so important to art, but as you're saying, it's such a central thing to each of us that we do gravitate to these metaphors, maybe even what Swedenborg would call correspondences to like spiritual reality, where these images of the natural world of these things that we would consider outside of ourselves, often we apply to things that we're feeling or kind of our internal environment. And there's this deep connection, between us and ecology, right? That
exactly.
And I do think you're right on around the psychology of it. It's a good point. Yeah.
It's an analogical way of viewing reality, if that makes sense. And I think this is one way to also think about like some of our earliest surviving examples of art. The wonderful cave paintings in France and Spain and Indonesia, they show a profoundly spiritual way of viewing the world. And we don't know a lot about, of course, what those of ours, 20,000, even in some cases, some of those cave paintings are over 40,000 years old, which is, compared to our last 2,000 years post-Christ, is just, humbling and awesome.
Mind-blowing.
Totally mind-blowing. And some of the people who've been thinking about cognition and how we're hardwired to create metaphors who've written about this early cave art, they would say that it was created and perhaps also meant to induce kind of an altered state of consciousness, where our normal linear coordinates of time and space became altered. The great German film director Werner Herzog has a beautiful documentary about cave art, which everyone should see, called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams. In fact, my oldest daughter, who's in 6th grade, just saw it in school. Her teacher showed it as part of their learning early human history, which is really funny to have her come home and say, this guy had such a strong German accent, it was so tacky, as you hear Herzog talk about cave painting. But in that movie, he makes the point that these images seem to have worked cinematically. They weren't just static. It was proto-cinematic. They were situated in such a way on the contours of the caves that they seem to move and come alive with flickering torchlight. They were magic pictures, to use our early word for actual cinema, magic moving pictures. And this is something that some of the historians who've tried to grapple with the bigger question of religion and our evolution as Homo sapiens. I'm thinking of Robert Bellah, who was at UC Berkeley. He died not too long ago. And in his last book about taking an evolution of religion and consciousness, he thought it was really all about play, about our symbolic capacity for altering and disfiguring our sense of reality to create kind of a different sense of time and space. And this is for him, religious experience. And that it was an evolutionary advantage for the human as a species to have this, because it lets us see the world differently. Other futures are possible, right? If you can get out of time and space and entertain other kinds of realities, it becomes possible to move in a different way in the world. And that becomes sort of a spiritual and ethical question in the end, right? This is in some ways what we're facing now with climate change. How can we envision a different future? How can we get out of the we've been born into in terms of our highly industrialized, turbocharged global capitalism, and think of modeling different futures?
Yeah, so important. And for me, it ties into kind of this other conversation around valuing artistry. And, we'll find that things don't go very well when we don't, I'm sure. But also this kind of, this economic system that we're in is kind of scarcity bound. We enforce that kind of scarcity, not just mindset, but reality of many people's lives. This country is super productive, like the most productive it's ever been. But the portion of that productivity doesn't go equally to labor as it does to capital. We kind of value money over human time by a huge amount. So you make a good investment on your capital if you're a shareholder, because it's in the bylaws of these corporations. But the labor, the life that people put into this every day isn't really valued the same way, and yet without them, we wouldn't be as productive as we are. And it seems tied in to me that both things are kind of suffering, and maybe we can imagine this future where we can enliven all these things that enliven us.
That's right. Yeah, right on. And I would agree. This is where religious traditions have a vital role to play in the conversation at the table about values that are beyond sort of a purely economic matrix around GDP, gross domestic product, and thinking about the bottom dollar as the sole value in systems of production, or even in our human happiness. Like, sociology and its statistics have been telling us for decades now that material stuff, in many ways, to grossly generalize here, our hyper-connected world with our smartphones and email and Amazon Prime to deliver the next thing we want within 24 hours, it doesn't seem to have made us happier as a culture or a nation or a species. So how might religious traditions offer a different calculus for what constitutes something other than a really simple notion of happiness as owning and buying stuff? Swedenborgian tradition, too, might have something to offer to that, and not just bigger traditions where a kind of asceticism or clearly delineated framework for thinking about human limits.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, that's right on, and it's something that I feel, we need more people like you, like maybe some of our listeners who care deeply about this to uplift it in multifaceted ways. But it's often like a hard issue to feel like we can make much progress in. But I think if we all do our part, and hold ourselves accountable in the ways that we feel are effective and good, then we're doing what we can.
It is overwhelming. I mean, we're sort of locked into an apocalyptic narrative that, when the big picture is considered, is indeed hard to manage. I mean, if you really read current work from climatologists and scientists who've been studying climate change for years, we're with our interconnected ecosystem. So what does one do? And in some ways, I think too often we think the doing has to be a kind of consumption, right? That, oh, if I had the money, I could go organic and buy all green whatever, or I should get this product even though it's more expensive instead of that one. I mean, in a very ingenious way that we sort of greened our cycles of consumption. But I think people who stand within a religious tradition or claim a kind of spirituality that's engaged, sometimes being ecological can be something radically different. Can be something like contemplation or wonder.
I like that.
Yeah.
And take to notice beauty. We develop an affection and love. And things we love, this sounds so simplistic, but it's true. Things we love, we don't want to hurt or injure. So how do we cultivate more spiritual love and affection for the beauty of the natural world? I think is part of it. And that doesn't have to in any way link into like whether you're going green with what you buy, or do you have an electric car, or do you ride a bike. I mean, that's all very important, but it shouldn't be the sole end in and of itself.
Yeah, I like what you just said. That's quite insightful. Good to hear. I think, yeah, there's something really powerful about that focus on the spiritual health and ecology or spiritual well-being. And, you know, yeah, we can do these things in our everyday living and buying. Some of us can do them more ably than others because we have the funds to go organic. And of course, there's ways to break out of the mold that are very different, and hopefully we can find some of those too in terms of, you know, how we're getting our foods and whatnot. But yeah, your point around spiritual ecology and maybe uplifting spiritual health in others might be a type of catalyst that isn't always leaned into. And as you were saying, we support the things we love. Well, if we kind of break away from this mindset of like selfishness or scarcity in our own living, even in our own spirit, even when, you know, we still have to work those 3 jobs, then maybe we can uplift the love and goodness in other people as coming from the same source as our own, and maybe start to love those things in them in a way that we hadn't before. Because, you know, in this capital, you know, this type of capitalism, I'm not saying they're all the same, but the way we approach it tends to be very competitive, and we don't look at the good in other people as something to be, you know, uplifted unless maybe they're working under us or something. But yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, in Swedenborgian terms, that would be into a heavenly community, right, where the good of the neighbor is the driving generator, a love of yourself and the things of the world that the self can acquire. But how to make that visible and tangible has always been the challenge and the sweet problem of being alive on this swiftly tilting planet.
Yeah. Well, in community and connection like this, and with this community and all our different forms of community are so important. Family, to uplift these ideas and approaches to the world, and not getting as defensive about our thinking as maybe we once did, and kind of being open to feedback and growth together. in a way that that leans into health, both internal and external, and in all its forms. Yeah, and you're right, heavenly.
Yeah, it's where our mediated technologies can actually be quite powerful and astonishing. It doesn't necessarily have to be the polarized polemics that so characterize, say, Facebook interactions of the last year and a half. But here I am at the sunset on the Pacific Ocean, and I'm talking to you, Cory, in the Midwest, and what fun different listeners are, and it's a community. Like, we're brought together by shared concerns, and there's sort of instantaneous communication across time and space. All you had to do is you would think of the person, and then come before you, your field of action, and telepathy. Here we are, in spite of the thousands of miles between all of us, which is cool.
Yeah, it's really powerful. And I'm sorry you cut out for a moment there, but what I heard was quite profound. And yeah, it's amazing that we can connect in this way across the world. Yeah, that's a good point. I think leveraging technology and finding new ways to do things and connect is could go a long way at tackling things that seemed impossible to tackle before. And I just want to take a moment to thank those in our chat. I see that Paige, she offered. I swear I wasn't just stealing from you, Paige, and not attributing you, but she was also saying that you should remember that writing is an art form, which I agree. It sounds like sometimes you can get bogged down in the detail of scholarly work, but I think we all appreciate not just your approach and the artistry of your sentences, but the artistry of the research and the motivations and everything around it.
Thanks. Someday, like my real wish one day would be able to have the time and the luxury and the space to, write a novel or more poetry. I used to do a lot more of that pre-academia. Maybe one day I'll get back.
Well, yeah, that would be. Well, you're quite. You have a lot on your plate, but that would be great if you could. And I think self-care is always important. And I know maybe it's not something. Maybe it's not something you hear all the time, so I'll say it. Taking time for that kind of work, and sometimes saying no is tough, but I think that's really important to do those things for yourself. And I know you're so impassioned by the work you do that you probably feel quite inspired and motivated, but sometimes things can kind of go one way, and we miss something that is quite vital and important to us.
Thanks, Cory. That school training coming out in a wonderful way, which you don't get if you do a PhD in English literature. Let me tell you. And even in the Swedenborgian traditions, like we have a hard time with the concept of self-care because so much of Swedenborg paints the self in a very negative way, or at least it's been received in that way. So this love of the self is something we have to eschew and consciously put off. What's the good in self-care? Isn't that just loving myself? Of course it's not, but I think this is one reason why there's sometimes in the Swedenborgian tradition that there's been a kind of hyper going on, which hasn't been always healthy.
That's a great insight. We often paint selfishness as like the opposite of loving the qualities, the divinity of loving the neighbor, loving God. But yet there is that role that self-care does play, and even selfishness in its rightful place, right? But yeah, I think often we kind of undercut it so much that we don't leave much room for really vital self-care. And if I may just share a few more thoughts from the chat seat quickly here, Devin. Paige also uplifted this connection between like science and art, and that there's such a deep connection there, that like equations undergird artistic forms, things like that. Thank you, Paige. That's a wonderful reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both Paige and Ward and others are appreciating your reflections on art, and appreciative of the art things that they've been able to do in their living and education, but also kind of regretting not taking other chances with artistic forms.
Right. Yeah, it's scary, you know. I mean, our culture doesn't value vulnerability, and to put a painting or a poem or something expressing yourself out there in words, it's you on the line, you know. I have a lot of respect for people who do that in whatever form.
Sorry about that. My dog. I do these outside. It's kind of like the ambiance of our services, and my dog gets protective sometimes. But
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, give Ghost a big hug and pat from someone. Ghost would probably remember my smell if
no, Ghost loves you. Yeah, that's right. You two are well acquainted. Yeah, and people, yeah, they're uplifting this emotional connection to art that they don't always get into in the chat. See, like get to lean into. Um,
Mhm.
and then knowing like historical context, Paige says, can lend a lot of appreciation to art, but also like what the goal of the artist was, and how they feel, and kind of what they're expressing. And in a way, that's kind of what Swedenborg is doing in his descriptions of these spiritual realms and metaphorical underpinnings. You know, in a way, he's describing the artistry of creation, and what is that point? What does the artist have in mind? And it's this uplifting, loving community.
Indeed, yeah. Art is like a time portal, people who are far away from us via time or space, and to every artwork is sort of a world view made by somebody, even if it's non-representational or totally abstract. It still is depicting a feeling of an experience in this world, and I think good art lets us see that other world.
I have to thank those of you in the chat for connecting, and um, you know, they, as you can tell, they, I feel like people are quite engaged by like artistry, leave it artistry, and these kind of like these deeper connections they have with the spiritual realm as you're uplifting, and that's something we would lose if we entirely divest from these artistic approaches. And it's kind of amazing to me, and one of the things I really appreciate from your work around what you were talking about earlier with like Emerson and Blake, is that this kind of mystical approach, this interfaith approach to spirituality in its different forms, because you know, even though Helen Keller and these other major American figures were so influenced by Swedenborg, they each approached it in their own way, in their own artistry, um, and you know, uplifted some really progressive ideas. And I think the more we do that, the more we follow in your footsteps and are inspired by uh, those that really try to progress these things that are so important today, but we lose track of them. The healthier we'll all be, the happier. Um, and not only that, but you know, if we're a little easier on each other, if we can uplift these artistries and this shared community, you know, maybe we don't have to be so anxious or stressed out, um, you know, so distracted by the needs of the day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah, it helps us get the deep time perspective in a sense. We get to transcend our own lives and even our own historical. It's akin to that feeling you get, you know, when you get out of the city and you go in the country and you look up at the stars, and even before you think and put it into words, there's that moment of wow and wonder at our little tiny place.
Yeah.
I think art provides that too, that we so often forget.
Well, Professor, I have to thank you again with my whole heart to have you on this evening, and I know the people in this community really appreciate your work and your sharing and taking the time to open up. It's quite inspirational, the things you're doing and what you have to share, and we're looking forward to the upcoming books and all the work. So thank you very much, Professor.
Thanks for in and listening, and I look forward to seeing some of you in other contexts, and good luck with all, and I hope I can join you again sometime in the not too distant future.
Yeah, we love that. And thank all of you for listening. I'll just take a moment to remind everyone that next week is our second book discussion on The Universe and I by George Dole, where science and spirituality meets. And we'll be doing chapters 2 and 3 next week. And we hope to have other wonderful guests like Dr. Zuber on soon. So join us Thursdays and Sundays, and go forth knowing that you are quite loved.